May 1943, Brest, France. Captain Zor Heinrich Lehmann Willenbrock stood at the window of his office, looking out over the submarine pens as the gray Atlantic swells crashed against the concrete breakwater. In his hand, he held the morning situation report. 3 more boats overdue. Another 3 crews, 150 men, who would never answer their radio calls again. Willenbrock was no ordinary U-boat officer. He was a most renowned submarine commander in Germany, the man whose daring exploits aboard U-96 had been chronicled by war correspondent La Gunther Buchem. Those stories and photographs would later become the legendary film Das Boot. He had sunk 24 ships, totaling more than 170,000 tons. He had survived depth charges that should have claimed his life. He had been awarded the Knight's Cross with oak leaves by Hitler himself. But none of that experience could explain the situation unfolding now. In the first week of May alone, the 9th Flotilla had lost 7 submarines, 7 boats that had departed Brest in perfect condition, crewed by experienced men, following established tactics. 7 boats that had simply disappeared into an ocean that had once been their domain. Something had changed in the Atlantic, something profound, and Lehmann Willenbrock, the man who had mastered submarine warfare, was about to discover that everything he knew had become obsolete overnight. To understand what Willenbrock faced in May 1943, it's necessary to look back just 18 months earlier, when he was still commanding U-96. The Atlantic had been a hunting ground where German submarines were supreme. Willenbrock had taken command of U-96 in September 1940, a brand-new Type WWII submarine fresh from the shipyards in Kiel. Within 3 months, he had turned the boat into one of the deadliest weapons in the Atlantic. His first patrol, departing Kiel on December 4, 1940, set the stage for what was to come. In just 25 days, he sank 5 ships, totaling over 37,000 tons. But it was his second and third patrols that turned him into a legend. On January 16, 1941, U-96 intercepted the British liner Oropesa west of Scotland. After 2 hours and 3 torpedoes, the 14,118-ton ship was sent to the bottom. 106 passengers and crew lost their lives in the freezing waters. The next day, Willenbrock found the Almeida Star, a 14,936-ton passenger steamer. It took 4 torpedoes to send her to the depths. All 360 people aboard perished, including passengers and crew. His third patrol was even more devastating, sinking 7 ships in one voyage, totaling nearly 50,000 tons. By February 1941, Willenbrock had sunk over 125,000 tons of Allied shipping. The Wehrmacht Bericht, the German Armed Forces daily report, announced his achievements to the nation. He received the Knight's Cross on February 26, 1941, and the oak leaves were added on December 31st of the same year. The tactics that made this success possible were brutally simple. U-boats traveled on the surface at night, their low profiles blending into the dark waters. They used diesel engines for speed and range, diving only when threatened. A skilled commander could spot a convoy by its smoke during the day, shadow it until darkness fell, then surface inside the convoy's escort screen and attack ship after ship before anyone even knew he was there. Admiral Karl Donitz refined these tactics into what he called the Rudel tactic, Wolfpack. Multiple submarines would converge on a single convoy, coordinated by radio from headquarters in Lorient. While escorts chased one submarine, others attacked from different directions. The system was devastatingly effective because it exploited a fundamental flaw in convoy defense. There were never enough escorts to cover every approach. In November 1942, at the peak of German success, U-boats sank 119 Allied ships totaling 729,000 tons. British merchant fleet losses exceeded new construction by 300,000 tons per month. At this rate, Britain would starve by the summer of 1943. Winston Churchill later admitted that the U-boat threat was the only thing during the war that truly frightened him. "I was even more anxious about this battle," he wrote, "than I had been about the glorious air fight called the Battle of Britain." When Lehmann Willenbrock left U-96 in March 1942 to take command of the 9th Flotilla at Brest, he was considered one of the finest submarine tacticians in the Kriegsmarine. He had completed 8 war patrols, spent 267 days at sea, and earned the Knight's Cross with oak leaves. His new mission was to send other commanders out to replicate his achievements. For the first year, they did exactly that. Submarines sailed from Brest and returned with victory pennants flying, their commanders reporting convoys scattered and merchant ships burning. Losses certainly occurred, but they were acceptable. The exchange rate still favored Germany. Then, in March 1943, something changed. Submarines began reporting strange encounters, aircraft appearing out of nowhere in the middle of the Atlantic, hundreds of miles from land. Destroyers that seemed to know exactly where submarines were hiding, attacks occurring at night in foggy conditions where detection should have been impossible. At first, the reports seemed like exaggerated tales from exhausted crews. Willenbrock remembered his own 7th patrol with U-96 in October and November 1941, when fatigue sometimes led men to see threats everywhere. But as the number of these strange encounters grew, Willenbrock realized something far more dangerous was at play. During the patrol with war correspondent Buchheim, the events that transpired would provide the foundation for everything that would later become Das Boot. They had left Street-Nazaire on October 27, 1941, and joined Wolfpack Stostrup 3 days later. On October 31st, they attacked convoy OS-10 in bright moonlight, sinking the Dutch freighter Benkom. The British escort sloop HMS Lulworth pursued them, driving U-96 under with gunfire and dropping 27 depth charges. The boat survived, shaken but intact. Later in the patrol, U-96 received orders to navigate through the Strait of Gibraltar and enter the Mediterranean. On the night of November 30th, as they approached the strait on the surface at high speed, a British Swordfish aircraft from 812 Naval Air Squadron spotted them. 2 bombs struck near the boat, causing damage that forced them to abandon the mission and limp back to France. Buchheim would later dramatize this event into the famous scene in Das Boot, where U-96 sinks to the sea flew at crushing depth, a fictional embellishment of what had actually been a narrow escape. The key point was that layman Willenbrock understood what it was like to be hunted. He knew the terror of depth charges, the long, tense hours of silent running, and the relief that came with escaping an attack. But what his commanders were now reporting was different. They weren't simply being hunted. They were being found before they could even begin their attacks. They were being detected under conditions that should have rendered them invisible. By the second week of May 1943, Willenbrock could no longer dismiss the events as bad luck or inexperience. The 9th Flotilla was losing submarines at an alarming rate, unlike anything he had ever experienced in his career. He spread the patrol reports across his desk, trying to identify any patterns. U-439 was sunk on May 4th, attacked by aircraft in the mid-Atlantic. U-638 was sunk on May 5th, depth charges from destroyers that seemed to appear without warning. U-531 was hit by an aircraft on May 6th, and U-438, U-125, and several other boats were also attacked by aircraft or destroyers in the same period. In just 3 days, 5 boats had been lost, and around 250 men had perished. The reports from surviving submarines were even more disturbing. One commander described surfacing at night to recharge the batteries, a standard procedure that submarines had done safely for 3 years, when, within 20 minutes, an aircraft appeared overhead and dropped depth charges. The boat survived only because the commander immediately crash-dived upon hearing the aircraft's engines. But how had the aircraft found them? There had been no moon. Visibility was less than a kilometer, and the MTOX receiver hadn't detected anything. Another commander reported approaching a convoy on the surface in complete darkness, with no moon and heavy overcast, when a destroyer turned directly toward him from 8 kilometers away and charged at full speed. The submarine barely escaped. Again, the MTOX had given no warning. These were not mere accidents. The Allies were detecting German submarines under conditions where visibility should have been impossible. The submarines were being spotted in conditions that should have made them completely invisible. Willenbrock requested a meeting with the technical intelligence staff at BDU Admiral Donit's headquarters. If anyone understood what was happening in the Atlantic, it should have been them. However, the response only deepened the mystery. German intelligence had detected no significant breakthrough in Allied technology. British radar, as far as they knew, still used the same 1.5-meter wavelength it had for years. The MTOX receivers installed on every U-boat were supposed to detect these radar signals from up to 30 kilometers away, giving the boats plenty of time to dive and escape. Some officers at BDU suggested that the British might have developed infrared detection systems capable of spotting submarine exhaust heat from aircraft. It was a reasonable theory. Diesel engines produced significant heat signatures. Others theorized that Allied aircraft might have been homing in on the MTO receivers themselves, as the very devices meant to protect U-boats could have been betraying their positions by emitting detectable radiation. Donitz took this second theory seriously enough to order U-boats to stop using their MTOX receivers altogether. But it made no difference. The losses continued. Both theories were wrong, and they revealed the depth of confusion within German intelligence. The brightest minds in the Kriegsmarine were grappling for explanations, unable to comprehend what was truly happening. The truth was far simpler and far more devastating. What German intelligence had completely failed to detect was a revolution in radar technology that had been deployed across the Atlantic. British scientists at the University of Birmingham had developed the cavity magnetron in February 1940, a device no bigger than a man's fist that could generate radar waves just 10 centimeters long, compared to the 1.5-meter wavelength used by conventional radar. The cavity magnetron was one of the most important inventions of the war. It worked by using a powerful magnetic field to make electrons spiral inside resonant cavities, generating microwave radiation of unprecedented intensity. The shorter wavelength provided dramatically better resolution, allowing operators to distinguish a submarine's conning tower from the surrounding waves. It could detect objects as small as a periscope or the breathing tube of a snorkel. Moreover, it operated on a frequency that German MTOX receivers were completely blind to. The British shared this technology with the Americans in August 1940, transporting it across the Atlantic in a black metal box as part of the Tizard mission. Churchill later called it the most valuable cargo ever brought to our shores. By March 1943, American engineers at MIT's radiation laboratory, the renowned ID Lab, had refined the cavity magnetron design and began mass-producing it at a scale that British industry could never have matched. Over 100 centimetric radar sets were being produced each month, and every Allied escort ship and patrol aircraft in the Atlantic was equipped with one. These radars could detect a surface U-boat at 30 kilometers in perfect darkness or heavy fog, track periscopes at 5 kilometers, and even spot snorkels, the breathing tubes that allowed diesel engines to run while submerged. And the Germans had no idea this technology existed. The statistics for May 1943 were catastrophic, surpassing anything the U-boat service had ever encountered. In a single month, the Allies sank 43 German submarines, killing over 1,000 submariners, most of them under 25, young men who had volunteered for what they believed to be an elite service. It was the worst month in the history of the U-boat arm, a disaster so complete that it earned the name Black May in German naval history. For Lehmann Willenbrock, watching from Brest, these losses were not just numbers on a chart. They were faces, men he had personally trained at the flotilla school. Commanders he had briefed in his office before their final patrols, going over charts and discussing tactics that were no longer effective. Young officers who had looked up to him as a legendary commander of U-96 and died believing in the methods he had taught them. In May, the 9th Flotilla alone lost 13 boats, about 650 men. Some of these men had sailed from the pens directly below his office window, waving to the ground personnel as they headed out to sea for the last time. The survivors who made it back to Brest told stories that would haunt Willenbrock for the rest of his life. One captain described being depth charged for 16 hours straight, trapped at 200 meters while charges exploded above him, shaking the hull until rivets popped and seams leaked. Every time he tried to surface to recharge his nearly depleted batteries, aircraft appeared within minutes. He only escaped by running his electric motors until they almost burned out, crawling away at 3 knots beneath the waves. Another commander returned with his boat barely functional, diesel engines damaged, hydroplanes jammed, and half his instruments destroyed. During the debriefing, he told Willenbrock something that crystallized the entire disaster into a single sentence. Herr Captain, they can see us. Day or night, fog or clear, they can always see us. Our tactics assume we can hide on the surface at night. We cannot hide anymore. We are fighting blind against an enemy who sees everything. On May 24, 1943, Admiral Donitz made a decision that would have been unthinkable just 6 months earlier. He ordered all U-boats to withdraw from the North Atlantic. The Wolf Packs, which had terrorized Allied shipping for 3 years, bringing Britain to the edge of starvation and seeming poised to win the war, were being pulled back. The official explanation was a temporary redeployment for technical upgrades, but every submariner in the fleet knew the truth. They had lost the Battle of the Atlantic. The technology that defeated the U-boats wasn't just centimetric radar. It was a comprehensive system of interlocking technologies, tactics, and intelligence that the Allies had developed while Germany remained unaware of the revolution unfolding around them. High-frequency direction finding, known as Huff-Duff by the British, could pinpoint a U-boat the moment it transmitted a radio message. The Wolfpack tactics, which Dönitz had perfected, relied on constant radio communication. Every time a commander reported a convoy sighting, coordinated an attack with other boats, or sent a position report, he revealed his location to Allied listening stations scattered across the Atlantic Rim. These stations could triangulate the position within minutes and direct aircraft or destroyers straight to the U-boat. Escort carriers, small aircraft carriers converted from merchant ship hulls, now provided air cover over the mid-Atlantic gap, the area beyond the range of land-based aircraft where U-boats had once hunted with impunity. A single escort carrier could cover hundreds of square miles with its aircraft, forcing submarines to remain submerged and unable to attack convoys effectively. New weapons also increased the lethality of every encounter. Improved depth charges, equipped with magnetic proximity detonators, exploded closer to their targets, increasing the chances of a kill. The Hedgehog, a forward-throwing mortar that launched 24 contact fuse bombs in an elliptical pattern, could destroy a submarine without the attacker losing sonar contact. Previous depth charge attacks required the escort to pass directly over the submarine, losing contact at the critical moment. The Hedgehog eliminated that vulnerability. Behind all of this was Ultra, the Allied code-breaking operation at Bletchley Park that had cracked the German Enigma cipher. Dönitz's orders to his submarines, the coordinates of Wolfpack patrol lines, the rendezvous points for supply operations, all of it was being read by British intelligence, often within hours of transmission. Convoys were rerouted to avoid U-boat concentrations, and hunter-killer groups were directed to areas where U-boats were known to operate. The Germans were completely unaware. Their cryptographers repeatedly assured them that Enigma was unbreakable. Mathematically unbreakable, the Germans' intelligence analysts attributed the Allies' successes to improved radar and extraordinary luck. They never realized, not until long after the war, that their most secret communications had been an open book to their enemies. Meanwhile, American industrial capacity were producing ships faster than U-boats could sink them. The Liberty ship program, using revolutionary prefabrication techniques, launched a 10,000-ton cargo vessel every 42 hours. At the program's peak, the Robert E. Perry was completed in just 4 days and 15 hours. 18 American shipyards employed over 650,000 workers, building these vessels around the clock. By the end of the war, they had produced 2,710 Liberty ships, more tonnage than Germany could have sunk in a decade of unrestricted submarine warfare. British shipyards were building escorts faster than Dönitz could train crews to attack them. The mathematics that had once terrified Churchill in 1942 had completely reversed. By summer 1943, the Allies were gaining ships faster than Germany could sink them. Lehmann Willenbrock continued to command the 9th Flotilla throughout 1943 and into 1944, but by then, he understood that he was presiding over a losing campaign. The boats he sent out faced odds that would have seemed impossible in 1941, when he had hunted the Atlantic with near impunity. Where he once expected victory, he now hoped merely for survival. Many of his crews would not achieve even that. In September 1944, with Allied forces closing in on Brest from all directions, Lehmann Willenbrock took command of U-256 and made a desperate escape. He was the last U-boat commander to leave Brest before it fell to American troops. For 44 days, he navigated through waters saturated with the very detection systems that had decimated his flotilla, the radar, Huff-Duff, patrol aircraft, and hunter-killer groups. On October 23, 1944, he reached Bergen, Norway. He had beaten the odds one final time. He survived the war. Many of his men did not. Of the approximately 40,000 men who served in the German U-boat service during World War II, around 30,000 died, making it the most lethal branch of the military, with a casualty rate of 75%. In later years, when asked about May 1943, Willenbrock spoke with the measured precision of a man who had spent decades analyzing what went wrong. The Allies hadn't just built better radar, he explained. They had built a better system. They coordinated their technologies, shared intelligence between services and nations, and adapted their tactics as conditions changed. The Germans, on the other hand, continued to fight the same way they always had. They trusted in the skill and courage of individual commanders, like Lehman Willenbrock himself, against an enemy who had made individual skill increasingly irrelevant. Against a system, courage alone was not enough. Against industrial power coordinated by intelligence and technology, even the bravest men in the world could not win. Heinrich Lehman Willenbrock died in Bremen in 1986 at the age of 74. A year earlier, he had served as a technical advisor for Wolfgang Petersen's film Das Boot, helping recreate the world he had known as a young commander, the cramped quarters, the camaraderie, the tension of the hunt, and the terror of depth charges exploding around a fragile steel hull. The film captured the experience of submarine warfare with brutal honesty, but it showed only part of the story. It revealed what life was like inside the boat, the courage, the fear, the desperate struggle for survival. But it couldn't show what Lehman Willenbrock learned as a flotilla commander, watching from the shore as the men he sent out vanished into an Atlantic that had become a killing ground. The Battle of the Atlantic was won not just by sailors and airmen, but by engineers and scientists. It was won in university laboratories and factory floors, in code-breaking huts and radar development centers. It was won in the invisible war of technology and industry that determined the outcome before the battles were even fought. The U-boat commanders of 1943 were some of the most skilled submarine officers in history. Their courage was unquestionable, but they were fighting against systems they couldn't see, couldn't understand, and couldn't defeat. That's a real lesson of Das Boot, not just what happens inside the submarine, but what happens when individual courage meets industrial power. When the bravest men in the world discover that bravery alone cannot win against an enemy who has built something greater than any individual.